The Boston Tea Party is often remembered in simplified terms as a group of angry colonists throwing tea into the harbor because they didn't want to pay taxes. But this act of defiance was far more nuanced than a protest against a beloved beverage. It was a calculated political and economic statement against British imperial control, not a riot driven by hatred of tea. In fact, many colonists were regular tea drinkers and continued consuming tea after the event, often smuggled from non-British sources. The issue wasn't the tea itself, it was what the tea represented: a growing web of economic domination, political exclusion, and colonial resentment toward a distant monarchy that treated the colonies as sources of revenue rather than partners in governance. The Boston Tea Party took place against the backdrop of increasing colonial frustration with British policies following the French and Indian War. Britain's national debt had ballooned, and Parliament believed the American colonies should help shoulder the financial burden. A series of taxes, including the infamous Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, stirred unrest, but it was the Tea Act of 1773 that reignited colonial anger in a uniquely explosive way. The Tea Act didn't actually raise taxes. In fact, it lowered the price of tea by allowing the British East India Company to sell directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. Yet this was precisely the problem. It gave a government-backed monopoly an unfair advantage, undercutting local business and reinforcing the principle that Parliament could impose laws and manipulate commerce in the colonies without local consent. Colonists saw the Tea Act as a dangerous precedent, a clever trick designed to get them to accept taxation without representation. If they bought the cheaper tea, they would be silently agreeing that Parliament had the right to tax them. To many, this was intolerable. Economic freedom was closely tied to political liberty, and both were under threat. The Tea Party protest, led by the Sons of Liberty and other activists, was not a chaotic outburst, but a strategic demonstration intended to draw a line in the sand. The destruction of the tea was carefully orchestrated. Participants even took care not to damage other private property or steal anything of value. They were making a specific and pointed statement. The colonies would not be manipulated through economic pressure, and they would not comply with unjust laws. In this light, the Boston Tea Party stands as a bold act of economic resistance. It was a challenge to imperial power and a declaration that colonial America was capable of organizing and asserting its rights. The event resonated across the colonies and in Britain, polarizing opinions and escalating tensions. British authorities responded with punitive measures intended to isolate Boston and crush dissent, but the opposite occurred. Sympathy for Boston spread, and the colonies began to see their struggles as shared rather than isolated. The Tea Party helped unify disparate groups under a common cause, proving that economic protest could be a powerful tool of political mobilization. Ultimately, the Boston Tea Party was not about tea. It was about power, representation, and the right to self-determination. It was a highly visible act that exposed the deeper grievances festering beneath the surface of colonial society. By turning an everyday commodity into a symbol of resistance, the colonists transformed a local protest into a catalyst for revolution, proving that meaningful change could begin not with weapons, but with bold ideas and deliberate action. The Tea Act of 1773 was a pivotal moment in the lead-up to the American Revolution, not because it imposed new taxes, but because it exposed the deepening rift between the American colonies and the British government over principles of authority, representation, and economic control. On the surface, the act appeared to be a practical economic measure designed to assist the struggling British East India Company, which was burdened with massive debt and warehouses overflowing with unsold tea. But beneath this financial rationale lay a political strategy that the colonists recognized immediately as an encroachment on their rights and autonomy. The act allowed the British East India Company to ship tea directly to the American colonies without first landing it in Britain, effectively eliminating the need for colonial middlemen and making the tea cheaper, even with the existing tax from the Townshend Acts. This was no small detail. It was an intentional move to undercut colonial merchants, many of whom were engaged in the profitable trade of smuggled Dutch tea. The British government assumed that by lowering the price of tea, it could coerce the colonists into purchasing it, thereby accepting Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. The logic in London was that the colonists would prioritize their wallets over their principles. But colonial leaders saw this as a thinly veiled attempt to create a monopoly and to gain colonial compliance through manipulation rather than legitimate governance. The Tea Act did not create a new tax, but it affirmed and enforced the existing tax on tea, which had already been met with resistance. Accepting the tea, in the eyes of many colonists, meant accepting Parliament's right to impose taxes without American representation, a concept that had become unacceptable following years of protest. The reaction in the colonies was swift and vehement. Merchants, smugglers, and political activists recognized the threat the act posed to both their economic interests and their political ideals. Public meetings were held, and newspaper editorials condemned the act as an instrument of tyranny. In many ports, citizens pressured tea agents to resign, and in some cases, ships carrying the tea were turned away before they could unload their cargo. The British government had underestimated the resolve and organizational capacity of the colonial resistance. Rather than pacifying the colonies, the Tea Act intensified opposition and galvanized the growing independence movement. In Boston, where tensions were already high, the arrival of tea ships from the East India Company presented a direct challenge. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, determined to enforce British law, refused to allow the ships to leave without unloading their cargo and paying the duties. This standoff culminated in the Boston Tea Party, where a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded the ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. It was a deliberate and symbolic act of defiance against both the Tea Act and the broader principle of unrepresentative governance. The Tea Act of 1773 thus became far more than a commercial regulation. It was a political catalyst that united different segments of colonial society: wealthy merchants, radical activists, and ordinary citizens, against a common enemy. It revealed how economic policy could serve as a vehicle for imperial control, and how seemingly modest legislative acts could have far-reaching consequences. The Tea Act sharpened the divisions between Britain and the colonies, escalated the conflict that would soon erupt into war, and demonstrated the power of organized resistance to challenge imperial authority. In rejecting the Tea Act, the colonists were not just rejecting British tea, they were rejecting British rule. The Boston Tea Party did not emerge from spontaneous rage or an uncoordinated mob acting on impulse. Instead, it was a carefully planned act of protest that demonstrated a growing sense of colonial unity and organizational strength. Over the years leading up to 1773, resistance to British policy had evolved from isolated reactions in individual towns to a more structured and interconnected network of colonial dissent. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, Committees of Correspondence, and other informal political organizations had been forming throughout the 13 colonies, allowing ideas, strategies, and support to flow across regional lines. These networks fostered a shared political identity that transcended local differences and emphasized collective colonial rights, creating the groundwork for coordinated action like the Boston Tea Party. In Boston, the resistance was particularly well organized. The Sons of Liberty, a group of artisans, merchants, and political activists, played a central role in rallying public opinion and executing plans. Their opposition to the Tea Act was not rooted in simple economic fear, but in a broader ideological commitment to defending liberty and resisting tyranny. When news arrived that tea-laden ships were en route to Boston, local leaders did not wait passively. Public meetings were held at Faneuil Hall and the Old South Meeting House, where thousands of citizens gathered to hear speeches, debate strategy, and express their outrage. These meetings were not chaotic. They followed clear procedures and often involved votes, showing that protest was being channeled through democratic action, even under colonial rule. The refusal of Governor Thomas Hutchinson to allow the ships to depart without unloading their cargo and paying the tea duty forced the hand of the protesters. Colonial resistance leaders knew that allowing the tea to be offloaded would set a dangerous precedent. Their response was not hastily thrown together. It was deliberate, precise, and tactically sound. On the night of December 16, 1773, over 100 men, some dressed in Mohawk Indian disguises as a symbol of freedom and a statement of American identity, boarded the ships and destroyed 342 chests of British East India Company tea. Notably, they did so without injuring anyone or damaging any property other than the tea. This level of discipline and purpose underscored the political intent behind the act. The Boston Tea Party also revealed the growing ties between colonies. Though the event occurred in Massachusetts, it resonated across the colonial landscape. Newspapers from New York to Charleston covered the event, and expressions of solidarity began pouring in from other colonies. The committees of correspondence played an essential role in this process, spreading information and mobilizing support. The British response to the Tea Party, the Coercive Acts, further strengthened colonial unity as other regions recognized the threat posed by British retaliation and rallied around Boston in protest. Supplies, money, and political support flowed into the city as colonists from different backgrounds and regions began to see themselves as part of a shared struggle. What began as local resistance was rapidly evolving into a movement with intercolonial cooperation at its core. The planning and execution of the Boston Tea Party reflected a broader transformation in the colonies, a shift from scattered opposition to a more cohesive political force. This growing unity and coordination would prove essential in the years ahead as the colonies moved from protest to revolution. The Boston Tea Party was a flashpoint not only for defying a specific law, but also for demonstrating that colonial resistance was becoming organized, strategic, and increasingly unified in its demand for self-governance and liberty. The Boston Tea Party was not only a protest against an economic policy, but also a deeply symbolic act of rebellion against what the American colonists perceived as growing tyranny from the British Crown and Parliament. The destruction of the tea was carefully choreographed to send a message that went beyond mere defiance. It was a deliberate, theatrical expression of a political idea. By disguising themselves as Mohawk Indians, the protesters did more than conceal their identities. They adopted a symbolic persona representing freedom, resistance, and an emerging American identity distinct from British rule. The Mohawk disguise was not random. It evoked the spirit of the untamed, free New World and rejected the imperial European image of submission and hierarchy. The participants in the Tea Party were making it clear that they did not see themselves as mere subjects of the king, but as a people with a unique claim to liberty. This act took place after years of escalating tensions between Britain and its American colonies. The colonists had endured a series of taxes and trade restrictions imposed without their consent, from the Stamp Act to the Townshend Acts, and now the Tea Act. Each law seemed to chip away at the self-governing rights the colonists had long enjoyed. British authorities claimed these laws were necessary to pay off debts and assert control over a growing empire. But to the colonists, they were infringements on natural rights and a betrayal of the English constitutional tradition. The symbolism of the Tea Party was rooted in this struggle, not just against a tax on tea, but against the broader concept of taxation without representation and the unchecked authority of a distant government. The protesters' decision to destroy the tea instead of stealing it or selling it on the black market was also highly symbolic. They were not motivated by personal gain, but by principle. They did not touch other property aboard the ships and took care to return ship equipment they moved during the raid. This careful discipline underscored the seriousness of their message. It was not a drunken brawl or a riot. It was a calculated strike against imperial power, carried out with intention and unity. By targeting tea, a common product tied to daily life and imperial commerce, they made a spectacle of British vulnerability and the colonists' resolve. The tea represented the overreach of Parliament, the favoritism shown to the British East India Company, and the erosion of colonial autonomy. By dumping it into the harbor, they symbolically rejected not just the product, but the authority it carried with it. The British government's reaction to the Tea Party, which included the Coercive Acts and the closing of Boston Harbor, revealed how seriously the act was taken. British officials saw the Tea Party not as mere vandalism, but as a direct challenge to their rule. The severity of the punishment only confirmed to many colonists that their worst fears about tyranny were justified. In the months that followed, the Tea Party became a rallying cry for resistance, inspiring political action, pamphlets, and organized protests throughout the colonies. Thus, the Boston Tea Party was a turning point in the American struggle for independence. Its power lay not in the financial damage it caused, but in its symbolism. It transformed an economic grievance into a moral statement, redefined the colonial relationship with Britain, and framed the conflict as one between liberty and tyranny. It was a moment where protest became performance, and political resistance became a declaration of emerging American identity and resolve. The Boston Tea Party represented a significant economic blow to the British Empire, particularly to the British East India Company, which was already facing dire financial trouble at the time. The destruction of 342 chests of tea, amounting to roughly 90 pounds in weight, was not only a physical act of protest, but a calculated economic sabotage. The tea thrown into Boston Harbor on the night of December 16, 1773, had an estimated value of over 10,000, which in today's terms would be equivalent to several $1 million. This was not a symbolic gesture alone. It was an outright assault on British commercial interests and a rejection of imperial economic control over the American colonies. The British East India Company was not just another trading entity. It was one of the most powerful and politically connected corporations of its time, enjoying privileges granted by the Crown, including monopolistic control over trade in the East. The Tea Act of 1773 was passed in part to help rescue this floundering giant by allowing it to bypass middlemen and sell directly to the American colonies. By making tea cheaper and more accessible, the British government hoped to entice colonists into compliance with the existing tax, while simultaneously stabilizing the company's finances. Instead, the colonists viewed the act as an insidious attempt to establish a precedent for Parliament's right to tax them without representation. The calculated destruction of the tea by Boston's patriots struck directly at the heart of this plan. Rather than allowing the cheap tea to enter the colonial market and undercut smuggled Dutch tea or local merchants, the Sons of Liberty and their allies made a dramatic statement that economic coercion would not be tolerated. Their act denied the East India Company the revenue it so desperately needed and publicly challenged Parliament's authority to impose trade laws on the colonies without their consent. The economic consequences of the Boston Tea Party were felt immediately. The loss of the tea cargo represented a substantial setback to the East India Company's bottom line and outraged British officials who viewed the destruction as a criminal act of insubordination. The response was swift and severe. Parliament passed what came to be known as the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts, which included the Boston Port Act. This legislation effectively shut down Boston Harbor until the lost tea was paid for, strangling the city's economy and punishing both the guilty and the innocent alike. Commerce came to a standstill, jobs were lost, and hardship spread, but instead of isolating Boston, the economic retaliation united the colonies in opposition to Britain. From the British perspective, the Tea Party was a flagrant act of rebellion that demanded an uncompromising response. From the colonial viewpoint, it was a justifiable rejection of monopolistic control and imperial overreach. The economic loss symbolized more than wasted tea. It represented a shift in power dynamics. The destruction of such a valuable commodity revealed the colonists' willingness to suffer economic consequences in defense of their political principles. It was a bold declaration that material goods, even those as prized as tea, were less important than liberty and self-governance. In this light, the Boston Tea Party's economic impact cannot be overstated. It catalyzed a chain of events that would escalate tensions between Britain and the colonies and accelerate the march toward revolution. By hitting the British where it hurt, financially, the colonists demonstrated that their resistance had both symbolic power and real-world consequences. It was a costly message, but one that resonated across the Atlantic and throughout history. In the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, the British government reacted with swift and severe measures designed to punish the Massachusetts colony and reassert control over what it saw as growing rebellion in the American colonies. These measures came in the form of the Coercive Acts, known among American colonists as the Intolerable Acts. Passed by the British Parliament in 1774, these laws were intended not only to penalize Boston for the destruction of the tea, but also to serve as a stern warning to other colonies contemplating similar acts of defiance. Far from restoring order, however, the Coercive Acts further inflamed colonial resentment and pushed the American colonies one step closer to revolution. The first and most immediate of these laws was the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston to all trade until the East India Company had been compensated for the lost tea, and the king was satisfied that order had been restored. This action brought the bustling port city's economy to a halt. With shipping frozen and goods unable to enter or leave, merchants, dockworkers, and laborers were thrown into economic despair. Instead of isolating Boston, however, the act prompted other colonies to rally in support. Supplies were sent from distant regions like South Carolina and Pennsylvania, and colonists who had once acted independently began to see Boston's plight as a shared threat to their collective liberty. The second of the Coercive Acts, the Massachusetts Government Act, essentially revoked the colony's charter. It restricted town meetings to once a year and placed the colony's government under direct control of royal officials appointed by the crown. This dramatically curtailed local self-governance, a right the colonists had long cherished. By undermining democratic structures, Britain signaled that it was no longer willing to tolerate any deviation from its authority, further convincing many colonists that their liberties were in jeopardy. The third law, the Administration of Justice Act, was equally alarming. It allowed royal officials accused of crimes in Massachusetts to be tried in Britain or another colony, where they were likely to receive more favorable treatment. Colonists saw this as an invitation for British officials to act with impunity, free from local accountability or justice. It represented, in their eyes, a blatant denial of their rights as English subjects to a fair and local trial by jury. The fourth act, the Quartering Act, required colonists to house and feed British soldiers, even in private homes if necessary. While not entirely new, the reinforcement of this policy during a time of heightened tension only further antagonized the populace. It reinforced the perception that Britain was not only exerting oppressive political control, but was also using military force to intimidate and dominate its own people. Together, these laws were designed to reestablish British authority, but they had the opposite effect. They galvanized colonial opposition, sparked widespread protests, and inspired the creation of the First Continental Congress in September 1774. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered to coordinate a collective response. What had once been fragmented acts of resistance were rapidly transforming into a unified political movement. The Coercive Acts, in their attempt to discipline and control, revealed how deeply out of touch the British government had become with the sentiments of the American colonists. Instead of restoring order, they fueled the perception that Britain intended to rule by force and suppression. These laws marked a turning point in colonial opinion, convincing many moderates that reconciliation was unlikely and that concerted resistance, perhaps even independence, might be the only path forward. The Boston Tea Party may have been the spark, but it was the British response through the Coercive Acts that turned that spark into a blaze. The Boston Tea Party did not immediately lead to war, but its legacy as a catalyst for revolution is undeniable. It served as a powerful moment of defiance that captured the attention of both the British government and American colonists, pushing the already strained relationship to the breaking point. While the destruction of the tea was a dramatic event in and of itself, it was the way this protest reverberated throughout the colonies and across the Atlantic that gave it lasting historical significance. It symbolized the growing determination of the colonists to defend their rights and reject the authority of a distant and increasingly unresponsive monarchy. The protest inspired similar acts of resistance and fundamentally shifted the way colonists saw their place within the British Empire. In the years leading up to the Tea Party, colonial resistance had taken the form of petitions, boycotts, and scattered acts of dissent. But the Boston Tea Party was different in both scale and symbolism. It was bold, public, and unmistakable in its message. The colonists were not just objecting to a single tax or policy, they were declaring that they would not be treated as subjects without a voice. The unity and precision of the event, combined with its theatrical nature, made it a focal point of colonial consciousness. It became clear that this was no longer a struggle about commerce. It was a struggle about principles, governance, and identity. The British government's reaction to the Tea Party made the legacy of the event even more powerful. The Coercive Acts, meant to punish and isolate Massachusetts, ended up uniting the colonies in a shared sense of injustice. Where there had previously been regional tensions and divisions, there was now an emerging consensus that Britain's treatment of Boston could easily be repeated elsewhere. Colonies that had previously watched events in New England from a distance began to see their own futures tied to the fate of Massachusetts. The result was the formation of the First Continental Congress in 1774, where representatives from 12 colonies gathered to discuss a collective response to British policies. This was a monumental step in the path toward independence, a shift from isolated resistance to coordinated political action. The Boston Tea Party also served to elevate and radicalize public discourse. Pamphlets, newspapers, and sermons celebrated the protest as a brave and moral stand against tyranny. The imagery of patriots casting tea into the harbor became a symbol of courage and defiance, influencing how Americans would come to understand their own history. As tensions escalated in the following years, the Tea Party was invoked repeatedly as an example of righteous rebellion. It was used to justify further resistance, including the mobilization of militias and the eventual declaration of independence. Its legacy extends beyond American borders as well. The Boston Tea Party has come to represent the idea that ordinary people can stand up against powerful institutions and make their voices heard. It remains one of the most iconic acts of civil disobedience in world history, taught as a pivotal moment in the broader struggle for democratic governance and human rights. In the end, the Boston Tea Party was far more than the destruction of a shipment of tea. It was the spark that ignited a revolutionary spirit across the colonies. It shifted the narrative from protest to purpose and marked the moment when resistance became a movement. Through its legacy, It helped shape the identity of a nation that would soon proclaim its right to self, rule, and inspire countless others in the pursuit of liberty.